Welcome back, everyone. Hope you're doing amazing today. This is the Tokyo trial. We did the Nuremberg trial, so go check that one out. I didn't know there was a Tokyo trial. There's a Yugoslavia trial we don't even know about. You might know about, but I didn't know about. So this is the Tokyo trial explained. I imagine this is just like the Pacific Theater, right? The Japanese, their atrocities being put on trial in a similar way. Probably came after the Nuremberg trial as like a precedent. But we're here to learn. Thank you guys for being here. Hit that like button. Let's go.
The Tokyo trial saw the end of the Japanese Empire's brutal regime. It helped lay the foundation for international criminal law and the International Court of Justice. And it was only the second time in history an international tribunal sentenced people to prison and to death.
I guess the first being Nuremberg.
But yet, it's barely mentioned in history.
Yeah.
Today, I seek to change that. Japan had been living in a self-imposed isolation for centuries, until 1854, when the USA forced it to open its ports and markets. Japanese leaders, realizing just how weak they had become compared to the rest of the world, created a plan to rapidly westernize, modernize, and industrialize. As Japan's economy grew, it soon ran out of the resources to run that modern economy. As a result, Japan would fight several wars to gain access to foreign resources, and eventually taking over a large part of Asia, until its defeat at the hands of Allied powers. As the Japanese army moved across Asia, it became apparent that they were committing atrocities on a massive scale.
Yeah. Most of these atrocities happen in China, but it's few and far between. There's a ton of them that occur. But yeah.
Slave labor, comfort women, massacres. When the tide of war had turned, the leaders of various powers came together to declare that the leaders of Japan will be punished. But the details of this were left vague. When Japan surrendered, the US came to occupy the island nation. And so the question of how Japanese leaders would be punished fell mostly to the USA.
Not a good arbiter, I would say. You would want an outside arbiter that would be less biased, honestly. But it is what it is.
USA decided to largely copy the system used to punish the German leadership after World War II, called the Nuremberg trial. It was a military tribunal to prosecute Germany's leaders for war crimes. If you want more information, there's a link at the end of this video.
Yeah, and definitely go check that. Definitely go check that video out. Not just because it's a video that we reacted to, but more or less it's a video that kind of like gives you a holistic understanding of like the precedent that the world was setting when they conducted this trial and what that meant.
USA established the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, or simply called the Tokyo trial. And with that came the question of who would participate in the trial. Well, it was decided that only the 9 countries who signed the surrender of Japan would get to sit in judgment over Japan.
The 9 countries, so you immediately get United States, you got Russia. I guess you have a bunch of others as well, that Canada, Australia, UK, France.
As well as India and the Philippines, colonies of the UK and USA respectively, who had also been fighting in the war. And so the tribunal would have 11 judges and 11 prosecution teams from each of the 11 countries. They came from Australia, India, Canada, China, France, Netherlands, New Zealand, Philippines, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and the United States.
So you get the big 3, and you get a bunch of others, primarily some UK colonies, but then you get China, the Philippines, the Dutch, and the French as well.
The defense, however, was comprised of 1/4 US lawyers and 3/4 Japanese lawyers. Next came the issue of exactly which crimes a person could be indicted for. After all, most of the atrocities weren't committed by the men on trial, but rather by their soldiers. And so it was determined that a person could be indicted for 3 types of crimes.
And that was the same kind of like system for the Nuremberg one.
Crimes against peace, such as planning, preparing, or initiating a war. war crimes, such as violating the rules of war like executing prisoners, and crimes against humanity, such as murder, enslavement, or deportation. Someone could be tried for any or all of them. However, a person would have to at least be indicted for crimes against peace in order to be tried at the Tokyo trial.
Okay.
Otherwise, they would be tried at lesser courts. For example, Hiroshi Oshima was the ambassador to Germany. This meant that he couldn't have committed war crimes or crimes against humanity, but he did help in planning a war. Thus he was found guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment, but paroled 7 years afterwards. He would die in 1975. Or take the case of Akira Muto. He helped plan several wars and commanded an army in the Philippines where his troops conducted a long list of atrocities. Thus, he was found guilty on all 3 types of charges and sentenced to death. And then came the question of how long ago an atrocity could have taken place.
1874? Honestly, I'm thinking like 1937 and forward. Actually, isn't that when they invaded Manchuria? Whenever they invaded Manchuria is what I would say.
After all, Japan had been fighting wars since the 19th century.
Yeah, but do we count those? Is that even relevant? I guess if the people are alive, it's relevant.
Not only would gathering evidence be difficult, the oldest men on trial were teenagers during the first wars. So it was decided that the leaders could only be indicted for crimes committed after 1931.
Okay.
For example, Koki Hirota served as foreign minister and prime minister before the Second World War, but he was still indicted for crimes committed before his retirement. Hence, he was still found guilty of crimes against peace and for waging war against China in the 1930s, and he was sentenced to death.
Dang.
In total, 28 men were indicted, 18 senior military leaders, 9 senior political leaders, and 1 scholar.
And it's kind of it's an interesting position we have here between Germany and Japan, and I wonder the intent of these individuals. I'm not defending them by any means, but I'm wondering the intent of these individuals, given the difference between whom they serve. In Germany, you serve a Führer, right? In Japan, you serve an emperor. Do Germans think the Führer was divine? Maybe. That's a possibility for sure. Do the Japanese think the emperor is divine? Of course, yes. So, given my answer there, my novice, biased, unchecked thoughts there, it feels like Japan would go further in some accounts than Germany does. Germany goes really far, horrendously far. But Japan does it as well. But I guess this argument it's nullified because of the Holocaust. And I would say, yeah. I just had to run that through my head. Because it's an interesting thought process. But it was a waste of time at the same time for you guys.
But none of them were from the Imperial family. The USA determined that having the emperor on the throne would make occupying and reforming Japan a lot easier. So even though the emperor and his family were co-conspirators in almost all
Yeah, see, that's what I'm thinking about. Like, what if Hitler was the emperor? Would we have spared him? That's a weird, thing right there. And especially for the United States, we're known for ousting governments, and we kept the emperor. Maybe that's why they built back so quickly. I don't know.
indictments, the USA decided against prosecuting the Imperial family.
Crazy, actually.
And not even the defendants would put any blame on the Imperial family, as they didn't want to portray the Emperor in a negative light.
Probably because he's a god. That's crazy, though. I would say at least a third of the blame has to go to the Emperor. At least a third of the blame. Then a third of the military leadership, and then a third to the individuals itself. But come on, bro. at least a third of the blame goes to him. He runs the nation, right? Right? Or do I have this wrong?
If they did comment on the emperor, then there would only be two outcomes. Either they would admit that the emperor was involved, or they would admit that they acted without the emperor's knowledge and thus committed high treason. And so, both the prosecution and the defense avoided the issue altogether.
That's so stupid.
But they weren't the only ones who escaped indictment. The leader of Japan's human experimentation unit also wasn't put on trial.
This guy's the poster child for this stupid. Gosh, that pisses me off. Human experiments? Throw him off a cliff.
They performed lethal experiments to test the limits of the human body, with methods too gruesome to mention in this video. The USA wanted the research results, and so traded the results.
I have no words. I have no words. We wanted the research, so we said, you good? What is this world we live in? Disgusting.
Results in exchange for immunity of all members of the unit. I left a link in the description with the Wikipedia article for more information. But be warned, the testimonies are quite gruesome, and other websites do have images of the victims which you probably wish you had never seen.
Yeah, I'm not gonna look.
The arrest of the 28 men who were indicted didn't happen smoothly though. Hideki Tojo attempted to commit suicide by shooting himself in the heart. He was prime minister from 1941 to 1944, presiding over most conquests of the Western colonies in Asia, as well as various massacres. He believed that the war was justified, and did not want to submit himself to a foreign tribunal whom they had just fought a war against. Hideki Tojo, however, missed his heart and
Bro pulled a Robespierre. But how do you miss your heart? Does he not know anatomy?
was resuscitated shortly afterwards.
Oh, jeez.
From then on, any arrest would be accompanied by medical professionals, so no war criminal could escape justice by hiding in death. Hideki Tojo accepted full responsibility in order to protect the emperor, was found guilty, and sentenced to death. The judges had assembled, the defendants were gathered, and the lawyers were ready. The trial would take 2.5 years,
Wow.
during which 2 defendants died of natural causes
They did escape with death.
in 1946. They were Yosuke Matsuoka, a diplomat who was one of the architects of the Tripartite Pact, and Admiral Osami Nagano, who oversaw the entire Japanese Imperial Navy.
Wow.
Another defendant was deemed mentally ill and unfit for trial.
So?
Shumei Okawa, a scholar who was put on trial for his influence over Japan's propaganda program. He acted oddly in court, such as wearing his pajamas or slapping a fellow defendant on the head. He was released from a mental hospital in 1948, spent his later years translating the Quran into Japanese, before passing away in 1957. Whether he faked his perfectly timed
I don't care. Put him on trial.
mental illness remains unknown.
I don't care.
The trial started with the prosecution presenting its case, spending over 6 months to present all the evidence against the defendants. Their job wasn't easy. As soon as the war ended, Japan's government ordered all troops to destroy any evidence of atrocities.
I was saying, did Germany do that? Because Germany had a ton of evidence.
As a result, the prosecution couldn't rely on direct orders of atrocities. So instead, they built their case around the idea that the atrocities were consistent, widespread, and strikingly similar. By proving this, the prosecution wanted to show that such acts could have only been committed if the Japanese government had ordered these massacres. After all, if atrocities were common and similar, then there would need to be some sort of central authority directing these similar acts. But even if that were true, that still wouldn't prove that these men on trial were personally responsible. Theoretically, it was possible that only a few of them directed atrocities while the rest were innocent. So the prosecution tried to prove 3 things for each of the defendants. 1. That the defendants were aware of the atrocities.
Okay.
2. that the defendants had the power to stop these atrocities, and third, that the defendants did nothing to prevent these atrocities.
So, you knew about it, you could have stopped it, and you didn't, is basically what it says.
And of course, there was almost no evidence that these men ordered any atrocities. But the prosecution was able to prove to the court that almost all defendants did nothing to prevent the atrocities while having the power to do so.
That's actually good damning evidence, because if it's so consistent and it happens so frequently, then they are definitely pro-atrocity, right? Because if they could have stopped it, shouldn't they have? Wouldn't they have?
Meaning that they were negligent in their duties to uphold the rules of war as laid out in various treaties before the Second World War. The defense lawyer...
And what is that? I know that's... We have, like... We've had several Geneva Conventions. We've had, you know, rules of engagement. We have the United Nations. We have ICC, etc. But in 1931, would these Japanese administrators, would these Japanese military officials known those rules of engagement, or is it echo chambered towards the Western world? I'm not defending, I'm just throwing out stuff.
Lawyers, however, fought adamantly for their clients, with one lawyer being quoted as saying, "I intend to hang 27 of the accused to save my client." They argued that the court wasn't impartial enough, with the Philippine judge being a victim of Japanese brutality who couldn't be impartial in his verdict, according to the defense.
You don't want that either.
Their request to replace the judge, however, was denied. But they went further, arguing that the trial as a whole did not hold any legitimacy, stating that even if the defendants were negligent in their duty, that they couldn't legally be held accountable.
You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of an English king that started a civil war, and Parliament didn't have the authority. Reminds me of that. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about.
They pointed out that many of the countries on the tribunal, such as France, the Netherlands, the UK, and the USA, were only on the tribunal because they colonized Asia, and they colonized Asia through aggressive wars of their own. The defense therefore argued that Japan's wars were no different than Western wars.
Okay. Not a horrible argument. Not relevant, but not a horrible argument. I think, first off, most of those people in those countries are dead that did those colonial arrangements in the 19th century. Most of those people are dead. For example, like Commodore Perry's definitely dead at this time. So, not a horrible argument, but not a relevant argument.
So why should Japan be held to a different level of accountability than the rest of the world? The defense also attacked the notion that Japan was fighting wars of aggression. Instead, they explained that for centuries, Europe and the USA had
That's not their territory.
invaded Asia, attacking Japan's neighbors one by one, and that Japan was being threatened by Western imperialism.
Their neighbors. Okay, over the centuries, Japan definitely traded with a lot of these nations, so you can definitely consider them neighbors. Obviously, you have the United Kingdom, Dutch, you have Russia up top, France, and some of these in like Indochina, the United Kingdom and India. Obviously, you have Australia and so forth. A lot of these places, but you could probably dissect each and every one of those in this court and give innocence to those colonial Western powers if you go down the rabbit hole for each and every case that there's like some reason for occupying it, you know? There could be like a scapegoat, we're stabilizing this. There could be a national security stabilization. Like, there's so many, and I'm saying it's right. I'm just saying there's an argument for every single one of these nations. Like Australia. Really, is that colonizing? Now there's Aborigine, but who else is there? Who are you colonizing? And I know that's like a straw man, but like, China and Korea technically aren't colonized. There's been port cities obviously in China, and there's been obviously, horrible things done, like the intolerable acts, and not intolerable acts. What are they called? It was like it was a century of embarrassment. I forget what it's called, but nevertheless, it's an interesting conversation. But is it relevant to your atrocities that you occurred? I think that it's too far gone, honestly. A lot of these people that originally did all these things in the colonizing of, for example, the Philippines, by originally the Spanish, by the way, and then the Spanish-American War, we took the territory and we tried to stabilize the region. There's a lot of conversation there, and I know we'll get to that one day. I don't want to spend too much time harking on all this, but I think there's a time and a place somewhere where those particular acts of colonialism could be addressed. This might not be the spot to do that. It's not a good defense.
One by one, and that Japan was being threatened by Western imperialism.
So you preemptively attacked China.
They explained that Japan was an isolationist country for 220 years until those powers forced Japan to open its markets to foreign trade.
True.
And when Japan was forced to modernize and industrialize to keep up with the invading Western powers, Japan had to invade its neighbors for...
Did not have to do that. So the argument is we had to keep up with the demand. So we had to invade to get all the resources to keep up for the demand. Or what? That's a horrible argument.
The resources it needed for its survival.
Horrible.
Just as Western powers had done. They argued that the USA cut off oil supplies to Japan as long as Japan was occupying the mainland of Asia.
Yeah, that was the embargo, which began the island hopping campaign, and then Pearl Harbor.
With only 2 years of oil supplies left, Japan was facing extinction, and so Japan was left with only two choices. Either Japan wasn't going to go to war, in which case Japan would certainly perish, or they would go to war, in which case Japan might perish.
So Japan has not gone to war since 1945, right? Have they perished? No, they have not.
If they perished without war, then Japanese culture would perish as other powers would dominate the island nation. But if they perished in war, then its people would rebuild their nation to once more rise to prominence another time. With the USA forcing Japan into these two options, Japan chose to go down fighting. And so, the defense argued, the blame of the war did not fall upon Japan, but rather, the blame of Japan's war against Western nations was the fault of the USA forcing Japan to go to war. Therefore, it should not be Japan, but the USA who should be put on trial.
What a sad excuse by these lawyers. Disgustingly sad.
There were various versions of this argument made by various defense attorneys, but all of them would follow a similar line of reasoning. But when it came to the atrocities committed during the war, the stories of the men were very different. Some claimed to not have known about them. Others claimed that they were justified.
Okay. The best argument there is I had no idea what you're talking about. For the people that justify them, they should have just took them out of the court right then and there.
For example, Iwane Matsui was commander of the Shanghai Expeditionary Force during the Nanjing Massacre. He defended himself with, "It is just the same in a family when an elder brother has taken all he can stand from his ill-behaved younger brother and has to chastise him in order to make him behave properly."
Stupid.
He was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death.
Good.
While others testified that they did indeed try to stop massacres and therefore weren't guilty. For example, Mamoru Shimegitsu actively tried to prevent war with the Western powers.
Really?
But the prosecution argued that he didn't do enough. That he could have stepped down, relinquished power, and choose not to remain part of the system. The court agreed, and sentenced him to 7 years in prison. He would be paroled after only 2 years, got back into politics, and served as foreign minister and deputy prime minister before passing away in 1957.
See, that seems fair. That seems fair. I'll call it how it is.
After 225 days of the defense presenting their argument, it was time for the judges to determine the innocence or guilt of the 25 remaining defendants. If over half the judges voted a person was guilty, then they would be sentenced. Out of the 55 different charges which could be brought against any of the defendants, the court ruled that 45 of them were either redundant or not authorized by the court, and most of the defendants would be acquitted on several charges brought against them. A total of 7 defendants were sentenced to death. Among those not already mentioned were Kenji Dohaira, chief of the intelligence services in Manchuria and instrumental for planning its invasion and occupation. He turned Manchuria into a vast criminal enterprise where assault, sadism, and a long list of other crimes became commonplace. Seishiro Itagaki, an important figure in the occupation of Manchuria. Haitaro Kimura, commander of the Burma Area Army who played an important role in the invasions of China and Southeast Asia. 18 defendants were sentenced to prison. Among those not already mentioned were Sadao Araki, served in various wars before the Second World War, sentenced to life imprisonment, but was released after 7 years due to ill health and passed away in 1966. Kingoro Hashimoto, major instigator of the Second Sino-Japanese War, sentenced to life imprisonment, released 7 years later, and died in 1957. Shunroku Hata, commander-in-chief of the China Expeditionary Force which committed wide-scale atrocities under his command, sentenced to life imprisonment, paroled after 6, and died in 1962. Kiichiro Hiranuma, served as Prime Minister and Chief of the Supreme Court of Japan, sentenced to life in prison, paroled after 4 years, and died shortly after his release. Naoki Hoshino, as Chief Secretary of the government, he was highly involved in Japanese war preparations. He was sentenced to life imprisonment but paroled 10 years later. He would go on to serve as president and chairperson of several companies before passing away in 1978. Okinori Kaya, finance minister. He prepared Japan's financial, economic and industrial policies for war, sentenced to 20 years in prison and paroled after 7. He rejoined politics and became Minister of Justice after being convicted of war crimes.
That's crazy. And the people must have elected him.
He died in 1977. Koichi Kido, one of the closest advisors to the emperor, sentenced to life imprisonment, released due to ill health 5 years later.
I guarantee if the Imperial family was convicted, he would also be convicted deeper.
And passed away in 1977, 24 years later. Kuniaki Koisho, governor of Korea, sentenced to life in prison, where he died 2 years later. Jiro Minami, minister of war. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, paroled 6 years later, and died in 1955. Takasumi Oka, minister of the navy, given a life sentence but was paroled after 6 years in prison and passed away in 1954. Kenryo Sato, chief of the Military Affairs Bureau, sentenced to life imprisonment until his parole 8 years later. He passed away in 1975. Shigetaro Shimada, minister of the navy, sentenced to life imprisonment, paroled after serving 7 years, and died in 1976. Toshio Shiratori, ambassador to Italy, found guilty of conspiring to wage war and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison a year later in 1949. Yoshijiro Umesu, chief of the Army General Staff, sentenced to life imprisonment. He also died in prison a year later in 1949. Shigenori Togo, Minister of Foreign Affairs, staunchly against the war with Western powers, he repeatedly advocated for both peace before and during the war. While he informed his superiors of the war crimes he was aware of, the court concluded that he didn't do enough. Sentenced to 20 years in prison and passed away 2 years later in 1950. Teiichi Suzuki, primary planner of Japan's wartime economy, sentenced to life imprisonment but paroled after serving 7 years.
7 years seems to be the commonality here.
He briefly rejoined government service and passed away at the age of 100 in 1989. Wow. With him died the last of the Tokyo trial defendants. The 7 men sentenced to death would receive their punishment about 6 weeks later, on December 23rd, 1948. The 7 men were executed by hanging, each dying instantly. No photographs were taken of these men after their executions, with the leader of the occupation force fearing it would embarrass or antagonize the Japanese people. Instead, 4 members of the Allied Council would act as official witnesses. Their bodies were cremated, and so ended the Japanese Imperial regime.
Oh.
If you like this video...
What a video. I might have came off a little bloodlusty in this video, but I really don't feel that way. I just hated the what do you call it? I can't think of the word because it's so early. The where you say something. Nevertheless, lack for the better words. The arguments were just so nullified. It's just ridiculous about, and, you know, we were forced to do that. What? That's your argument? I mean, I guess when you're in this big of a corner, you know, you're that trapped in a corner of the things you did, you come up with something ridiculous, right? But obviously, colonialism in general is bad, but it would be like if, you know, someone, for example, let's just say, I don't know, any country that's ever been colonized, they just put all the 99% of their budget towards military conquest, and then just start attacking people. And then they say, well, they did it 212 years ago. Okay, great. But why are you doing it? I thought wouldn't you be better than that? That's my thing. Like, wouldn't you be better than that? It's a horrible thing that the United States has ever colonized. And I mean, the UK, the France, whoever, right? But it's not. It was a precedent that was not set in morality quite yet. Morality did not dictate what colonialism was and is. Colonialism really was more bedded in capitalism, with capitalism not even being the economy policy, but just the what do you call it? The acts of what more resources will give you, not always in a capitalistic front, but more or less in a resource front. And it was more about like the scramble for Africa or other European nations whenever they were trying to go after things like Asia, etc., or the Americas. They were trying to expand their sphere of influence on this ever-growing world. And these minds and these individuals that did that, we will never really know what was going through their head. Maybe we do, and maybe we just haven't got to that. But it's an interesting thing to kind of like point to them and say they did it. Why can't we? It's kind of weird, especially when you have more knowledge of the impact of that throughout, you know, time. It's not a good look by any means, but more or less, you know, it is what it is. That was the Tokyo trial. Not as harsh as the Nuremberg trial by any means. I still think it's kind of weird that the Imperial family is just like, cool, you're good. I guess that's the compromise of trying to like rebuild Japan. And the human experiment thing was just probably the worst thing I saw out of all that. I'm not gonna look at any of those images, but the thing is, why would we trade not innocence? Why would we trade their innocence in this entire thing for data? You could extract the data through the trial if you really wanted to. I don't understand. I don't understand why we would do that. I know why we would do it, but I don't understand why we would do that. That's so disgusting. That was the Tokyo trial. We got the Yugoslavia trial to do next. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave me some video suggestions down below, and peace out. Bye-bye.